members pro tem who are ruling the roost today in rules. Look, the appropriations bills we're looking at here are a pretty striking example of how the MAGA majority continues to be completely out of touch with the American people, with all the stress on spending cuts and an unwillingness to address the debt drivers such as the Trump-era tax cuts, which have so driven up the debt. The bills we're seeing here push steep cuts to essential programs for my community, for your communities. Cuts to programs that the American people rely upon and which are so extreme that the Senate's not going to go along with it. We are hearing that the motivation behind much of these cuts is to try to undo the long overdue investments that were made in the last Congress in climate rescue, in transportation and infrastructure, things that have been neglected for far too long. So, to start, the transportation and housing bill would cut funding for infrastructure programs by nearly a third. Just 2 years ago, we took a major step forward to meet critical infrastructure needs by passing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Already, it's made billions of dollars in long overdue investments in communities all over the country. We're seeing bridges in Pennsylvania collapsing because they have been neglected for so long. This bill and the funding that is being cut in this latest iteration is really necessary. And while the bill had passed with widespread bipartisan support, at least in the Senate, now we see Republicans taking every possible opportunity to undo the progress we've been making in fixing our infrastructure. And today they're trying to cut funds for our roads, our highways, our trains, our ports. I got here by Amtrak today. It really needs the money. But there's more. No matter where you live, our country is facing a crisis in housing affordability. We need more housing that working families, seniors, and veterans can afford. But instead, this bill would cut funding to build more affordable housing by almost 70%. And they want to cut nearly all funding for programs to get lead out of people's homes. We have kids with lead pipes that we're still trying to address in Pennsylvania. This is a huge issue across all of my community, where the average age of housing stock is over 50 years, and in many areas, including Philadelphia, the average age of the houses is over 90. The MAGA Interior and Environment Bill is even more extreme. Here, there's a proposal to cut EPA funding by almost half, cutting the agency's funding to the lowest level in 30 years. I mean, that just doesn't make sense given the environmental challenges that we're facing. Certainly, I'm old enough to have seen the difference that EPA funding and regulations have made in our communities. We really should not be trying to go back. This is a naked attempt to gut our nation's environmental laws. The MAGA majority, if they get their way, will have more smog, more air pollution, unsafe drinking water, and a virtual halt in cleanup efforts at Superfund sites and brownfields. We'll see shorter hours, we hear, at our national parks, and deferral of overdue maintenance, which already threatens places like Independence Hall, as well as the wonderful outdoor recreational areas we have out west. Shows that the Republicans' hand and all their talk about smaller government and responsible spending is really just a Trojan horse to force draconian cuts on broadly popular investments in our American communities. It's bait and switch politics. It's bad leadership, and of course it violates the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act, which passed just earlier this year, both houses. So I think it's partisan politics at its worst, and legislating this way is bad for the House. It guarantees that we'll get jammed by the Senate, hate getting jammed by the Senate, and we'll be cut out of any serious negotiation about the federal budget. So I strongly, obviously, object to the bill. Ms. Pingree, could you speak just for a minute on the environmental justice piece that you mentioned? Because I have several communities in my district that are regularly impacted by flooding and environmental hazards. And I think you indicated that there's some serious cuts to the programs that we included in the Inflation Reduction Act to try to address some of those long-standing issues that threaten many of our communities.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Thank you to both of my colleagues for
There are thoughtful remarks about some of the problems with this bill, and you're right, this basically guts the environmental justice. You know, what that did, and what we were able to do in the last round of this bill, was to make sure that we weren't disproportionately only cleaning up those communities that people of higher income lived, where it was, you know, already a comfortable community. And the communities that have tended to take on the environmental damage over the years have been those disadvantaged communities where we've located the factories, where we've had polluted rivers. So the environmental justice funding in the last year's bill was really to make sure that the EPA was trying to bring that funding onto a par. So gutting that in this bill is just a tragedy. And also the work that we tried to do in the IRA, it was recognizing that too. I think we've seen a real turnaround in the Biden administration, and in the year we were able to write the appropriations bills and we were able to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA. Those were bills that really recognized where do we want to fund communities in the future and where do we want to make sure we do some of the important cleanup to make sure that we get back on an even keel here. So thank you for mentioning that. And thank you also for saying that this bill really sets us back on the important mission that we have on climate change, on recognizing that it is our responsibility at this moment in time to deal with the challenges of the climate crisis and make sure that we leave a planet for our children and grandchildren. And if we don't deal with this now, if we're actually thinking of going backwards, we're really ignoring our responsibility.
Thank you. I mean, certainly the many, many voters at the 19 colleges and universities in my district have very strong opinions about our failure to act more aggressively with respect to these climate change issues. And the folks in Eastwick and Chester and Norristown who are depending on this funding to be able to address some of the long-standing environmental threats to their communities are going to be gravely disappointed if this has any chance of passing, which I hope it fails spectacularly. Thank you. I yield back.